The church smelled like candle wax and cedar, and Mara Whitlock had been standing at the altar for exactly 4 minutes when she understood that something was wrong. She could feel it before she could name it. The way Reverend Aldous kept clearing his throat, the way the organ had stopped a beat too early, the way her mother in the front pew had gone very still with her hands pressed together too tight in her lap. Mara counted the wooden boards in the floor because she didn't know what else to do with her eyes. 17 boards between the door and the altar. She'd counted them twice. The church held maybe 80 people. Red Hollow wasn't a big town, but a wedding drew everyone in from the outlying farms and ranches, and they had all come today. She could hear them breathing. Thomas Greer finally appeared in the doorway at 12 minutes past the hour. He was 26 years old, the second son of Harold Greer, who owned the largest mill operation in Callaway County. He had dark hair combed with something that made it shine, and he wore a suit that had been pressed so flat it looked like the creases could cut. Mara had met him 3 times. Each meeting had lasted under 20 minutes, and her parents had done most of the talking. He walked down the aisle, and the room was very quiet. Mara watched him come toward her, and she tried to remember what her mother had told her to do. Stand straight. Keep your chin up. Don't fidget with the dress. She had practiced all 3 in her bedroom mirror for a week. Thomas Greer reached the altar. He stopped. He looked at her. Really looked the way a man looks when he's seen something for the first time and trying to decide what it is. And his face did something that took about 2 seconds to complete. It started somewhere around his eyes. A flicker, quick and involuntary. Then his mouth pulled sideways. Then he laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh. It wasn't nervous or uncertain. It was the kind of laugh that comes from genuine surprise, the kind a person makes when something is funnier than they expected. He turned back toward the congregation as if checking whether they were seeing what he was seeing. "I can't," he said. He was still half smiling. "I'm sorry. I genuinely cannot." Someone in the 3rd row laughed first, then someone else. The sound rippled back through the pews like something spilling across a floor, and within 10 seconds the entire church was full of it, low and mean and bright all at once. The kind of laughter that has a target. Reverend Aldous said, "Now, son." "My father didn't tell me." Thomas Greer was shaking his head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "He said she was playing. He didn't say—" He gestured in her direction, a loose, careless motion with 2 fingers, like he was indicating an obstacle in a road. "I'm sorry. I'm sure she's a fine woman, but I have a reputation to maintain." Mara didn't move. Later she would not be able to explain why. She had not made a decision to stand still. Her body simply didn't receive any instructions from the part of her that was supposed to be giving them, because that part had gone somewhere else entirely. She stood at the altar in the dress her mother had made, ivory cotton with small buttons up the back that her mother's fingers had gone stiff and slow trying to fasten that morning. And she held her small bouquet of dried wildflowers, and she listened to 80 people laugh at her. Her father was sitting in the 2nd row. She did not look at him. Her mother had turned to face the wall. Thomas Greer said something else, something lighter, meant to smooth things over with the crowd, and several people in the front rows chuckled in the gentler, more comfortable way people chuckle when they've decided an awkward situation has resolved itself. He adjusted his jacket and took a step back toward the aisle. Then a voice came from the back of the church. "I'll marry her." The laughter stopped. It didn't fade gradually the way crowd noise usually does. It stopped all at once, like a door closing. 80 heads turned toward the back of the room. The man standing there was tall, not in an exaggerated way, just tall in the way some men are, the kind of height that makes them easier to find in a crowd. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, and he was wearing a coat that had seen considerably more weather than the occasion called for. His hat was in his hands. He was turning it slowly by the brim, and he was looking at the altar, not at the congregation. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Reverend Aldous found his voice first. "I beg your pardon?" "I said, I'll marry her." The man walked forward. He moved without any particular hurry, the way a person moves through a space they're familiar with even when they're not. The aisle was narrow, and he kept to the center of it. People leaned away as he passed. "If she'll have me." He reached the altar and stood about 4 feet from Mara and looked at her directly for the first time. She didn't know him. She was almost certain she had never seen him before in her life. He was older than Thomas Greer by at least 15 years, and his face had the kind of weathered quality that came from time spent outdoors in every kind of season. There was a scar along his left jaw, thin and pale. His eyes were gray. "My name is Cole Barrett," he said, to her specifically, not to the room. "I run cattle out past the Henderson Creek cutoff. I have about 400 head and 60 acres and a house that needs more work than I've given it." He paused. "I'm not asking you to decide this minute, but I want you to know the offer is honest." Mara stared at him. Her mouth opened slightly and then closed again. Thomas Greer made a short sound somewhere behind them, half amusement, half irritation, and said, "Barrett, this isn't the time for one of your—" "Nobody asked you." Cole didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Mara. The church was so quiet she could hear the candles. She heard her mother's voice then, thin and urgent from the front pew. "Mara, Mara, say something." What Mara said was, "Why?" Cole Barrett considered the question for a moment, turning his hat once more in his hands. "Because someone ought to," he said, "and it might as well be me." It was not a romantic answer. It was not the answer she'd imagined, in the very distant and private part of herself that still allowed for imagining. But it was a real one, and she had not received many of those today. "All right," she said. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Reverend Aldous performed it with the expression of a man who had presided over many unusual situations in 30 years of ministry and was not entirely certain this one cleared the bar. He asked the necessary questions. Cole answered them in a flat, unhurried voice. Mara answered them in a voice she could barely hear herself. The congregation watched in a silence that had long since moved past stunned and was edging towards something more uncomfortable. The particular discomfort of people who had laughed at someone who turned out not to be as defeated as they'd assumed. Thomas Greer had left. The door at the back of the church had swung shut behind him before the ceremony was half over. When it was done, Cole shook Reverend Aldous's hand and thanked him. Then he turned to Mara and said, "I have a wagon out front. We can go whenever you're ready." She had one trunk. She had packed it the night before in the expectation of leaving with a different man, and most of what was inside were practical things: clothing, a few books, a sewing kit her grandmother had left her. She had not packed much that was sentimental because she had not wanted to appear to be leaving permanently in case she needed to come back. Standing on the steps of the church with the trunk at her feet, she thought, "I am not coming back." Her father came out behind her. He looked at Cole Barrett and then at his daughter and then at the wagon, and his face moved through several expressions before settling on one that Mara didn't quite have a name for. "Mara," he said. "Don't," she said. She didn't look at him. "I want you to know that your mother and I know what you want me to know." She picked up the smaller of her two bags. "I'll write when we're settled." Cole had come down the steps and was lifting her trunk into the back of the wagon without being asked. He did it without ceremony, without making any show of his helpfulness, as though it was simply a thing that needed doing, and he was the one standing closest to it. Her father stood on the church steps and said nothing else. Cole helped her up onto the wagon seat, offered his hand, didn't insist on it, and she took it because the step up was higher than she'd expected, and she nearly stumbled. His grip was steady. He let go as soon as she was settled. He climbed up on the other side and took the reins. "We've got about 2 hours of daylight left," he said. "The ranch is an hour and a half out if the creek hasn't flooded again. There's food at the house." "All right," she said again. She seemed to have been saying that a great deal today. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and they moved forward, and Red Hollow began to fall away behind them. She didn't cry until they were well past the edge of town, past the point where the road curved south, and the buildings disappeared behind a stand of cottonwood trees. She turned her face away and put her hand against her mouth and let it happen quietly, without making much sound, because she was in a wagon with a stranger and she didn't know the rules yet. Cole didn't say anything. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the reins, and he didn't offer her a handkerchief or a reassurance or anything else, which she appreciated more than she could have explained, because it meant she wasn't being watched. She got it under control after a few minutes. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." I'm not usually. She stopped. It's been an unusual day. Yes, he said. It has. The road was dry and rutted, and the wagon jolted over it steadily. The sky in the west was going orange along the bottom edge. A pair of hawks were circling something in a field to the left of the road, and she watched them for a while instead of thinking. Do you do this often? She asked. He glanced at her. Offer to marry strangers? Yes? No, he said. This is the first time. Then why? I told you why. You said someone ought to. She kept her voice even. That's not a reason. That's a deflection. Cole was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. The horses moved at a steady walk, and the cottonwoods thinned, and the land opened up into long, flat grass going gold in the evening light. My wife died 6 years ago, he said finally. Fever. Took her fast. He didn't look at her. We had a girl, too. She was 4. Same fever 2 weeks later. He paused. So, I know what it looks like when someone is standing in a room full of people and they're completely alone. Mara did not say she was sorry. She got the impression it wasn't what he wanted. You saw that, she said. Hard to miss. She looked at her hands in her lap. Her knuckles were still white around the small bag she was holding, and she made herself loosen them deliberately, finger by finger. I didn't know what to do, she said. When he laughed, I couldn't think of what I was supposed to do. You stayed standing, Cole said. That's not nothing. It wasn't, she supposed. It had not felt like much at the time. They rode in silence for a while. The road climbed slightly and then dipped toward a narrow creek crossing, and the horses slowed for it, picking their way across the flat stones. Water came up around the wheels, but not high. Cole had been right that it hadn't flooded. On the other side, the land changed. More trees, scrubby cedar and juniper, the terrain going rougher and more uneven. She could see the shapes of hills beginning in the middle distance, going dark against the sky. The house, Cole said, nodding toward something she couldn't quite make out yet. About another 20 minutes. What's it like? He thought about that. Honest, he said. It's not pretty. It needs the south roof looked at before winter, and the porch railing on the east side is half rotted. The kitchen is good. Someone put care into the kitchen. Your wife? Yes. She nodded slowly. She was trying to build a picture of what she was riding toward, what the next days would look like, what would be expected of her. She was very aware that she knew almost nothing about this man, that she had agreed to marry him based on 30 seconds of observation and the fact that he had been the only person in that church who had moved toward her rather than away. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer plainly. Go ahead. What do you expect from this? From me, I mean, in practical terms. Cole looked at her directly for a moment, then back at the road. I expect nothing that you don't choose to give, he said. I have plenty of work. I don't need someone to perform a role, eh? If you want to help around the ranch, I'll welcome it. If you need time first, take it. He paused. There's a room off the kitchen. It was my daughter's. I've kept it clean. It's yours if you want it. She absorbed that. You're not expecting a wife, a real one. I married you in front of a reverend and 80 witnesses, he said. That's real enough. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. He didn't seem bothered by the directness of the question. I'm not going to demand anything from you, Mara. That's what I mean. If things change between us, if you want them to, we can talk about it then. But I'm not holding you to any expectation you didn't agree to. She sat with that for a while. The shape of the house was becoming clearer in the fading light. Low and wide, made of wood and riverstone, with a barn off to one side and a lean-to attached to the barn, and fencing stretching away in multiple directions. Cattle were visible as dark shapes in the middle distance, moving slowly toward a water trough. It was not a beautiful place. It was exactly what he'd described, honest. It had the look of somewhere that had been worked rather than curated, where every structure existed because it served a purpose and nothing had been added for appearance. She found to her surprise that she didn't mind that. He showed her the house without commentary or apology. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace that clearly got heavy use, and a shelf of tools along one wall. The kitchen was larger than she'd expected, with a good iron stove and a deep basin sink and shelves of provisions that had been stocked recently enough that she noticed. He'd known he was bringing someone home. he'd prepared. The room off the kitchen was small, a narrow bed with a plain quilt, a washstand, a window that looked out toward the eastern hills. There was a child's drawing still pinned above the window, faded and water-stained, depicting something that might have been a horse or might have been a very unfortunate dog. She didn't mention it. He didn't take it down. "There's a pot of beans on," he said from the doorway. "They'll be ready in about an hour." "I can make cornbread," she said, "if you have the meal. Second shelf, left side." She found the cornmeal and the skillet, and she stood in this stranger's kitchen and made cornbread in the iron pan while the beans simmered and Cole went out to finish whatever evening chores needed doing. She could hear him moving in the barn, the low sound of his voice when he talked to the horses, which she noted he did. She stood at the stove and listened to the fire and to the land outside going quiet as dark came on. She had no idea what her life was now. She had no idea who this man was, not really. One conversation in a wagon was not a person. She did not know what tomorrow would look like or the day after that. She did not know if she was safe or if the choice she'd made on 30 seconds of instinct in a church was the worst decision she'd ever made, or if it even mattered, because the alternative had been standing on those church steps while her father failed to finish a sentence. She turned the cornbread and watched the edges brown and waited for Cole Barrett to come back inside. He came in when it was nearly dark, hung his coat by the door, washed his hands at the basin. He sat down at the table and she brought the pan and he served them both without making it into anything ceremonious. And they ate together in the first quiet she had felt all day. "Thank you," she said, "for the food." "Thank you for the bread," he said. "Mine comes out wrong." "What do you do wrong?" "I don't know. That's the problem." She almost smiled. She wasn't ready to actually smile yet, but she could feel the shape of it somewhere nearby. "Too much fat in the pan," she said, "before you pour the batter. You're probably rushing it." "Probably," he agreed. They finished eating. Cole cleared the plates. She offered to wash them, and he let her without making a point of it either way. Outside, the wind was picking up, pushing against the west wall of the house with a low, persistent pressure that she felt through the floor. "Storm coming," Cole said. "From the west?" "Usually is." He banked the fire in the kitchen for the night, moving with the ease of a man who had done the same thing 10,000 times. "Sleep when you need to. Mornings start early here, but I don't expect you to be up at my hour right away. Give yourself time." "I'll be fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not assessing, not doubting, just looking, and then he nodded once and went to his room and closed the door quietly. Mara stood in the kitchen for a while with her hands at her sides. The fire ticked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the scrubby trees near the house, and the cattle were making low sounds somewhere in the dark. She went to the small room and took off the wedding dress and folded it, not with any particular tenderness, just because she'd been raised to fold things, and set it on the floor in the corner because she didn't have a better place to put it. She put on the plain cotton nightgown she'd packed, and she lay down on the narrow bed under the plain quilt, and she looked up at the faded child's drawing above the window. A horse. She was fairly sure it was a horse now. The wind pushed at the walls and the fire in the kitchen ticked, and somewhere in the dark a coyote started, and then stopped. And the frontier night settled around the little house like something heavy and patient and full of everything she hadn't figured out yet. She was not all right. She was very far from all right. But she was not standing in a church being laughed at, and the man in the next room had asked nothing of her except to exist, and the bed was narrow, but it was hers, and she was, for reasons she couldn't yet articulate, still standing. She closed her eyes. Outside, the storm came in. The storm lasted 3 days. It wasn't a dramatic storm, not the kind that knocked down trees or flooded the creek past fording. It was the grinding kind. Steady, cold rain that came in sideways off the hills, turning the yard to mud and the fence post to dark, wet columns, making every outdoor task twice as miserable and half as productive. Cole worked through all of it. Mara watched him from the kitchen window the first morning, pulling on her boots before she'd fully decided to, and by the time she'd gotten her coat and stepped out onto the porch, he was already halfway across the yard with a bucket in each hand, moving toward the barn at the same deliberate pace he seemed to move at all times, like the rain was simply weather and not a reason to change anything. She crossed the yard after him. The barn was warmer than the house, close with the smell of hay and horses, and the particular earthy dampness that large animals produce when they've been shut in from rain. 4 horses in 4 stalls, all of them restless from the weather, shifting and snorting and putting their ears back at the sound of the wind against the roof. Cole was already at the nearest stall, running a hand along the mare's neck, murmuring something too low to hear. "What do you need?" Mara asked. He glanced at her. She got the impression she'd surprised him. Not in a large way, just a small, recalibrated way, like he'd been expecting something different. "Water buckets need changing. Hay in the back 3 stalls is wet on the top layer. Needs pulling and replacing. There's dry stock in the loft." "All right." She spent 2 hours in the barn that first morning and came back inside with mud on her coat and hay in her hair and her hands red from the cold. And she made oatmeal on the stove and left half in the pot for whenever Cole came in. He came in 40 minutes later, ate standing at the counter because he was still in his wet coat, and didn't say much. But he finished all of it. That was how the first days went. She didn't wait to be assigned tasks. That was partly because she was uncomfortable with waiting. She'd been raised in a house where idleness drew criticism, and partly because work was the one thing that required no social negotiation. She could muck out a stall without having to figure out what to say. She could patch the split in the feed sack with the twine hanging by the barn door and not have to decide how formal they were with each other yet. Cole noticed. She could tell he noticed because every few days something shifted slightly. A tool would be moved to a more logical location, or a job she'd been doing one way would be done differently the next morning in a way that was quietly more efficient, and she'd realize he was adjusting to her adjustments. They were building a working vocabulary between them that had nothing to do with words. Still, she was careful. She had not forgotten where she was. In a stranger's house, on a stranger's land, legally bound to a man she'd known for less than a week. Cole's patience and decency were real, she thought. She believed they were real, but she'd believed things before about how people would treat her, and she'd been wrong in very public and painful ways, and she wasn't going to let herself assume anything. So she watched. She watched the way he handled the horses, which was the most telling thing about a person she knew. Whether they got impatient, whether they were rough when they thought no one was looking. He was neither. He was consistent with them the way he was consistent with everything else, the same low voice, the same steady hands, regardless of the horse's mood or the weather or whether the day had been difficult. The bay gelding, who was young and still inclined toward foolishness, tested him regularly, and Cole responded each time with a patience that didn't look performed. She watched the way he ate, quickly, without comment, not picky, but not indifferent either. He'd eat whatever she cooked, and he'd eat all of it. But if something was done particularly well, he'd pause at the end and say something short about it. Not effusively, just an observation. "The stew's better than mine," or "That's a good crust." She found she liked it more than she expected to, that specific, unsentimental version of appreciation. She watched the way he dealt with problems. A section of fence on the north pasture had come down in the storm, and she went with him to fix it on the 4th day when the rain had mostly stopped and the mud was beginning to firm. They loaded the wagon with posts and wire and spent the morning driving it out and working the line side by side, and she noticed that when a post went in wrong, too shallow, slightly crooked, he didn't swear or kick at it. He pulled it, reset it, drove it again. No drama. Just the problem, and then the solution, repeated as many times as necessary. "You're not an impatient man," she said, working wire through the staple with hands that were getting better at it. "No," he agreed. "Is that something you learned or something you always were?" He considered that for a moment, the way he considered most things. Not evasively, just genuinely, like the question deserved actual thought. "Learned, mostly," he said. "I used to have a temper, not mean, but quick." He drove the last staple into the post. "Ranch work cures it eventually. You can't hurry cattle." She thought about that. "Or people." He looked at her. "Or people," he agreed. They finished the fence line in the early afternoon and drove the wagon back, and she thought the whole ride home about what it meant that he had just indirectly told her he wasn't going to rush her, and whether she trusted that, and whether trust was even the right word yet for what she was tentatively extending in his direction. The word she finally settled on was provisional, sopetsu. The hard part, the part she hadn't anticipated, was the nights. The days were manageable because the days were full. There was always something: feeding, mucking, hauling, cooking, the thousand small maintenance tasks that a ranch of this size generated continuously. She was tired by dark, in a way she hadn't been since she was a girl helping on her grandfather's farm, and tired was useful because it meant she slept. But there was a period between dark and sleep, lying in the small room with the child's drawing above the window, where she had nothing to do but think. And what she thought about, more reliably than she wanted to, was the church. It wasn't the laughter she returned to, it was Thomas Greer's face. That flicker of genuine surprise and then amusement, so immediate, so unguarded, like her appearance had been a joke he hadn't expected to be in on. She hadn't expected him to love her. She had understood the arrangement clearly enough, but she had expected, what? Some minimal acknowledgement of her personhood? Some performance, even an insincere one, of basic decency? What she hadn't expected was that she wouldn't even clear the bar for performance, that she was so easy to dismiss that he hadn't bothered with pretense. She lay in the dark and picked at this the way a person picks at something that hurts, and knows it hurts, and keeps doing it anyway, because at least the pain was something real to hold on to. On the 8th night, she couldn't sleep at all. She got up at some point past midnight and went to the kitchen and started a fire in the stove and put water on for tea, and she was sitting at the table with her hands around the cup when she heard movement in the main room. Cole appeared in the doorway. He had on work pants and a loose shirt, and his hair was disordered from sleep. He looked at her without particular alarm, like he'd half expected this or something like it. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "I heard you up." He crossed to the stove and looked at the pot. "Any more water?" "I'll make more." He sat down at the other end of the table while she put another pot on, and he didn't ask her what was wrong or fill the silence with anything. He just sat, and that was, more than she would have predicted, the right thing. She brought him tea and sat back down. Outside, the sky was very clear and the stars were dense, and the land beyond the window was dark and enormous. "I keep thinking about it," she said finally. I don't want to. I can't stop." He nodded. He didn't ask what she meant. "The worst part is that it didn't surprise me," she said. "That's the part I can't get past." He laughed, and my first thought wasn't, "That's not fair," or "That's not right." My first thought was, "Of course." She looked at her cup. "I'd already decided that about myself before he got to." Cole was quiet for a moment. "How long?" "How long what?" "How long had you decided that about yourself?" She thought about it seriously. "I was 12 the first time someone said something, really said something, where they meant for me to hear it, at school." She paused. "By the time I was 16, I'd heard enough versions of it that it stopped sounding like someone else's opinion. It just sounded true." He turned the cup in his hands. "And your parents?" "They loved me," she said. "I think they did. But love from people who are ashamed of you it's a strange kind of love. It comes with conditions attached to it that everyone pretends aren't there." The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, nothing moved. "The arrangement with Greer," Cole said. "That was their idea." "Yes." "Did they tell you it was to make things better for you or for them?" It was a direct question. She'd noticed he asked those, not to wound, but because he apparently couldn't see the point in asking around things. "They said it was for me," she said, "that a woman in my position needed the security of a husband, and they'd found one willing." She paused. "But Greer's father was owed money by mine, the mill contract." She set her cup down. "So, both, I suppose?" Cole said nothing to that. His jaw was tight in the way it got sometimes when he was working something over internally that he wasn't going to say. "It's not remarkable," Mara said. "It's not even unusual. I know that. That doesn't make it acceptable." "No," she agreed. "But it makes it comprehensible. And comprehensible is easier to carry than arbitrary." He looked at her then with an expression she didn't quite have a name for. Not pity, she was sure of that, and not admiration exactly. Something in between those, or somewhere off to the side of both of them. "You're harder on yourself than you are on any of them," he said. "Probably. It shows up in how you work," he said. "You're the first person to notice when something's not quite right, and the last to accept that you've done enough for the day." She hadn't expected him to have noticed that. "Is that a complaint?" "No, it's an observation. He finished his tea. You don't have to earn anything here, Mara. I want to be clear about that. You're not here on a trial basis. She looked at him. The firelight moved across his face, and the kitchen was warm and the night outside was cold and enormous, and she was in a stranger's house that was beginning, in small and specific ways, to feel like it might not always be a stranger's house. I don't know how to do that, she said. Not earning. I know, he said, but you'll figure it out. He got up and rinsed his cup at the basin and went back to bed, and she sat at the kitchen table for a while longer watching the fire and listening to the land outside. 3 weeks in, she made a mistake with the horses. She'd been bringing the young gelding, the bay Cole called Trouble, which she was beginning to understand as literal, into the barn for the evening. She'd done it a dozen times without incident, but she'd been tired and not paying attention, and she came through the gate too quickly, and the gelding spooked sideways and got loose, and she spent 40 minutes in the gathering dark trying to get him back into the paddock while he ran circuits and thought the whole thing was spectacular. By the time Cole came to help, she was furious and mud-splattered, and she'd already done the thing she always did when she was embarrassed, which was go cold and clipped and extremely precise in her movements. They got the horse in together, Cole approaching from the far side to cut off the angle while she finally got hold of the lead rope. She was pulling mud off her coat in the barn when Cole said, "It happens." "Not to me," she said. "Not like that. Oh, Trouble spooked me twice since I got him. I wasn't paying attention. It was careless." "It was," he agreed, without softening it. "Also, not the end of the world." She looked at him. He was checking the gelding's legs for any scrapes from the fence, running his hands down in that focused, methodical way of his, and he said it so matter-of-factly that the self-flagellation she'd been winding up toward didn't quite get traction. "You're very difficult to fight with," she said. "I've been told that." "By whom?" He glanced up from the horse's leg. "My wife, mostly." It was the second time he'd mentioned her. The first had been in the wagon the first night. She didn't push further. He'd finished checking the leg and was moving to the next one, and she could see in the set of his shoulders that it had cost him something to say, just slightly. "What was her name?" Mara asked quietly. A pause. "June." "That's a good name." "She had her mother's eyes," he said. "Both of them did, she and Lily." He said the second name carefully, like it was something he handled without letting himself think about handling. "You'll find the photograph on the shelf in the main room. Top shelf, left side. I put it there after. I thought about putting it away, but that seemed worse." She had noticed the photograph on her first day, but hadn't looked at it directly. She went and looked at it that evening after supper. A woman with light eyes and a steady, open expression, holding a small girl with curly dark hair, both of them squinting slightly against sun. The photograph had been taken outdoors, somewhere with grass behind them, and whoever took it had caught them in the middle of something. The woman turning toward the camera from a conversation, the girl mid-motion, something funny apparently having just happened. They had been happy in the moment of that photograph. The happiness was visible. She put the photograph back exactly as she'd found it. The rhythm of the ranch was nothing like what she'd known in town. In her parents' house, days had a social architecture. The morning meal at a specific hour, the weekly visits, the errands that were also performances, the ongoing management of what people thought. On the ranch, there was no such architecture. There was what needed doing and what could wait, and the weather, which had opinions about both. There was the land, which was indifferent to everything she'd spent 23 years believing mattered. She found slowly that she preferred it. She preferred the clarity. She preferred that when she fixed something, a broken stall hinge, a split in a water trough, a fence post that had been listing for too long, it stayed fixed, and that was the end of it. She preferred that the horses didn't care about anything except whether she was trustworthy and calm and consistent, and that they told her immediately if she wasn't. She was, in these weeks, learning things about herself in a setting where no one was watching her learn them. She learned she had a better hand with the horses than she'd known. The bay was still a menace, but after the paddock incident, she started spending time with him differently, slower, no tasks, just presence. And after a few days, he stopped testing her as energetically. Cole observed this from a distance without commenting directly, which was its own form of acknowledgement. She learned she was better at sustained physical work than she'd believed. Her hands toughened, The specific muscular fatigue of hauling and lifting and kneeling in hay stopped being novel and became ordinary. She learned that she'd spent most of her life in a permanent low-grade state of readiness for humiliation, a kind of bracing against anticipated impact, and that on this ranch, where no one expected her to be anything other than whatever she actually was, that bracing had nowhere to go. It didn't disappear. She wasn't naive enough to think it would in a few weeks, but it was starting to feel like armor she was wearing inside a house where there was no one to fight. It was uncomfortable to put down. She didn't entirely know how. Cole seemed to understand this without her saying anything. He didn't try to tell her she was fine, or that things were better now, or that she ought to let herself feel safe. He just maintained the same undemanding consistency he'd maintained from the first night. And she began to understand that this was, for him, a form of care. Not the reassuring kind which needed a response from her, but the structural kind which just held. One afternoon in the fourth week, they were patching the roof of the smaller outbuilding, which had been losing shingles since the storm and was starting to leak into the corner where the tack was stored. Cole was up on the roof, and she was on the ladder passing things up, and at some point he said, without preamble, "You're not what I expected." She paused on the ladder. "What did you expect?" "Not sure exactly. Someone more diminished after what happened." "I was diminished." "I know. But you didn't stay that way." She handed up a bundle of shingles. "What choice was there?" "There's always a choice," he said. "Some people stay in it. Stay in the diminished place. It's not a criticism. It's understandable. The world keeps insisting you're small. It's hard not to believe it." She thought about the nights in the small room, the picking at old wounds. "I believe it plenty," she said. "I just don't let it decide everything." He was quiet for a moment, working the shingles into place. "That's the part I meant." She climbed back down for more materials, and she stood at the bottom of the ladder in the thin autumn sunlight, and she thought that in 23 years of her life, a number of people had said a number of things to her and about her, and that this was the first time she could remember anyone distinguishing between what she believed about herself and what she allowed it to do, as though the two could be separate, as though believing a thing didn't automatically mean surrendering to it. She was still thinking about it when Cole climbed down at the end of the afternoon and they walked back to the house in the long, slanted light, and she made supper from what was left in the larder, salt pork and potatoes, and some wilted greens she rescued with butter. And they ate together in the kitchen in the way they ate together every night now, which was comfortably silent in the specific way that comfortable silence has, of demonstrating that two people have stopped needing to fill space between them. After he'd cleared his plate, he said, "We'll need to go into Red Hollow next week. Supplies." She set her fork down. "I know," he said. "We don't have to stay long." "I know we don't." She was looking at her plate. "I just—" She stopped, started again. "I know it has to happen." "We can go to Meriton instead," he said. "It's 20 miles farther, but the supply house is adequate." She looked up at him. He was watching her in that steady, non-pressuring way of his, just making the offer, not making a point of making it. "No," she said after a moment. "It's Red Hollow. I'm not going to rearrange the route because of people I don't owe anything to." Cole nodded once. "All right. I might not be good company on the way back." "You don't have to be." She picked her fork back up. Outside, the wind was moving through the cedar trees near the house, and the fire in the stove was low and warm, and the land was settling into the particular heavy quiet of a frontier evening, where the silence had weight to it, and heft, and all the things that hadn't been said yet were simply suspended in it, patient and unhurried, waiting for whatever came next. The night before they were supposed to go into Red Hollow, Mara didn't sleep. She lay in the small room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind and went through the whole thing in her mind the way she went through problems she didn't know how to solve. Methodically, corner to corner, looking for the part she could control. She could control what she wore. She could control where she looked. She could control the pace of her breathing when someone said something, because someone would say something that was as certain as the weather. What she couldn't control was the fact that 80 people had been in that church, and most of them lived within 10 miles of Red Hollow's main street, and they all had mouths and nothing particularly pressing to do with them. She got up before dawn and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the dark outside go gray. Cole came in at first light, already in his coat. He looked at the coffee and then at her. "You could have slept another hour." "I could have," she agreed and handed him a cup. He didn't press the point. They drank their coffee standing up in the kitchen in the early light, and he told her what he needed from the supply house: fence wire, lamp oil, salt, flour, 2 specific sizes of bolt he'd been ordering since spring. She told him she needed thread and a new needle, and she was going to look at the fabric if they had decent muslin, because the curtains in the small room had a tear in them she'd been ignoring. "We can take the longer road in," he said. "Comes out at the north end of town instead of past the church." She looked at him. He was watching his coffee cup, not her face, which she suspected was deliberate. "You thought about the route," she said. "I thought about the route." She turned back to the window. The sky was going pale orange over the eastern hills. The horses in the paddock were visible as shapes against the light, moving slowly toward the water trough. "The longer road," she said. "Yes." "All right." They loaded the wagon in the cold morning air without much conversation, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about working alongside Cole, that he didn't fill silence out of discomfort, and so silence between them had stopped being uncomfortable. She handed things up, and he secured them, and trouble made his feelings about being hitched to the wagon abundantly clear, and Cole dealt with it without raising his voice. They set out as the sun was coming up properly, and Mara kept her eyes on the hills and didn't think about Red Hollow until she had to. The longer road added 40 minutes to the trip, and the last stretch of it came out onto the north end of Main Street past the feed store and the blacksmiths, which meant they bypassed the church entirely. She noticed this with a complicated gratitude. She wasn't sure she could have driven past the church without something happening to her face. Red Hollow, on a Tuesday morning, was not particularly busy. A few wagons outside the general store, some horses tied along the rail, a woman she didn't recognize going into the post office with a stack of letters. Cole pulled up in front of Hartwell's Supply and set the brake and climbed down, and she climbed down on her side and straightened her coat and told herself to keep her face neutral. The first person who saw her was an older woman named Ada Pruitt, who ran the seamstress shop 2 doors down from Hartwell's, and who had been in the 3rd row of the church. Mara knew her by sight. Ada saw her, registered something. Surprise. Adjustment. And then turned very deliberately back toward whatever she'd been looking at in the seamstress shop window. Not acknowledgement, not greeting, the specific pointed non-response of a person who had decided to pretend they hadn't seen something. Mara kept walking. Inside Hartwell's, it was warm and smelled like burlap and machine oil. Ed Hartwell himself was behind the counter, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray beard and a habit of looking at a spot just past whoever he was talking to. He saw Mara first, and the look that crossed his face was something she was familiar with. Not malice exactly, more like recalibration, the expression of a person who needs a moment to figure out what register to operate in. Cole came in behind her and said, "Ed, I need 2 spools of 14-gauge fence wire and a case of lamp oil. Got a list for the rest." Hartwell shifted his attention to Cole with what looked like relief and said, "Cole, sure. Let me see that list." Cole put the list on the counter, and Hartwell looked at it and started calling things off to the boy in the back, and Cole stood at the counter with his hands resting easy on the edge of it, not tense, not performing nonchalance. Just there. Mara went to look at the fabric. It was in the back corner of the store, bolts of it stacked horizontally on wooden shelves, calico and muslin, and a wool flannel that was probably not locally popular in summer, but would be useful in 2 months. She was looking at the muslin and calculating yardage when she heard the front door open and a woman's voice say, "Ed, do you have—" and then stop. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished calculating the yardage. The voice continued a register lower. "Well, I see." Mara turned then. Margaret Voss. She had been in the front row of the church, 2 seats from Mara's mother, and she had not been among those who laughed. She'd made a small sound of dismay instead, the kind a person makes when they've witnessed something they find distasteful but aren't quite willing to intervene in. She was about 50, tall, with a long, serious face that Mara associated with having opinions. "Mrs. Voss," Mara said. Margaret Voss looked at her for a moment with an expression that had several things moving through it in quick succession. Then she said, "You look well." It was such an unexpected thing to say that Mara almost laughed. "Thank you," she said instead. "The ranch suits you." It wasn't a question or a compliment exactly. It was more like an observation, one Margaret Voss was making to herself and happened to say aloud. She looked at the fabric bolts. "The muslin on the second shelf is better quality than the top. Ed keeps the better stock where people don't think to look." Then she went to the counter and started talking to Ed Hartwell about salt pork prices and didn't look at Mara again. Mara stood there for a moment. Then she took the muslin from the second shelf. Well, the trouble started outside. They had loaded most of the supplies and Mara was waiting beside the wagon while Cole went back in for the last box when she heard footsteps on the boardwalk behind her and turned and found herself facing two men she knew by reputation, if not by name. Brothers, both of them Greer associates, the kind of men who attached themselves to the edge of local power and did most of their damage through talk rather than action. The one in front, the taller one, had a face that knew exactly how much he could say and still be called joking. "Didn't expect to see you in town," he said. Not to her, technically. To the space near her, to his brother, to anyone who happened to be listening. Heard Barrett's got himself a project. His brother made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Mara had made a decision somewhere between the house and Red Hollow that she was not going to look away today. She didn't remember making it consciously, but she was aware of it now, standing with her hands at her sides on the main street of a town that had laughed at her 6 weeks ago. She looked at the taller one directly and said, "Do you have something to say to me?" He blinked. He hadn't expected that. "Because if you do," she said, "say it to my face. I'd rather know what I'm dealing with." He opened his mouth and then closed it, and did the thing people do when their material stops working and they haven't prepared anything else. His brother was looking at the ground. "That's what I thought," Mara said, and turned back to the wagon. Her heart was going hard in her chest. Her hands were not entirely steady, but she had said it aloud and she was still standing, and that was something. That was something she hadn't been able to do 6 weeks ago. Cole came out of the store with the last box and she helped him load it without saying anything about what had just happened, and he didn't ask because he'd seen enough of it from the doorway. He secured the box and came around to her side of the wagon and said quietly, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. He helped her up without making a production of it. He drove them out of Red Hollow at the same unhurried pace he did everything else. She watched the town fall away behind them, and she breathed slowly through the next 10 minutes until her heartbeat was something approaching normal. "Those men," she said eventually. "Greer's people?" "Adjacent to Greer's people," Cole said. "Harlan and Dennis Fitch. They do his family's errands and think it makes them something." "They weren't expecting me to say anything back." "No, people like that usually aren't." She sat with that for a while. The road curved south past the cottonwoods and Red Hollow disappeared and the land opened up around them, flat and gold and enormous in all directions. "I wasn't expecting to say anything either," she said. Cole glanced at her. Something moved across his face that was brief and genuine. "Sounded like you'd been saying it for years." "I've been thinking it for years. It's different." "Getting shorter," he said. "The distance between thinking and saying." She looked at him. He was watching the road. The sun was at the midpoint of the sky and the horses moved at their steady walk and the wagon creaked over the dry ruts and somewhere off to the right, a hawk was working the thermals in long, slow circles. "Cole," she said. Why did you actually do it?" "Marry me." He was quiet. "I need you to tell me the real answer," she said. Not the church answer. Not someone ought to. The actual one." He drove for a while without responding, long enough that she thought he was going to redirect or give her another partial answer, the kind that was true as far as it went but didn't go far enough. Then he said, "Pull up a minute." She wasn't sure who he was talking to, but then he drew the reins and the horses stopped and they were sitting still in the middle of the empty road with nothing around them in any direction except grass and sky and distance. He set the reins across his knees and looked at his hands. "June died in February," he said. 6 years ago, February. And I didn't do well with it. I'm not going to explain all the ways I didn't do well with it because most of them aren't things I'm proud of, but the main thing is I stopped being present. I just ran the ranch and didn't talk to people and let years go by. She waited. I went to the church that day because Jim Aldis asked me to help move some furniture beforehand, and I stayed for the service because it seemed rude not to. He rubbed his thumb across his knuckles. I was sitting in the back and I wasn't paying much attention, and then I heard the laughing start and I looked up. He stopped. "And?" she said. "You weren't crying," he said. "That was the thing. You were standing there with everything falling apart around you, and you weren't crying and you weren't running and you were just still, like you decided you were going to stay upright no matter what it cost you." He shook his head slightly. "I've seen men in bad circumstances who couldn't hold it together the way you did in that moment. And everyone around you was laughing and you were just bearing it, alone." Mara was looking at the horizon. The hawk was still circling. "I knew what that was," he said. "Being alone in a room full of people." He picked up the reins again. "And I thought, if I let her walk out of that church alone, it's going to mean something about who I've decided to be in the last 6 years. And I didn't like what it meant." He clicked to the horses and they started moving again. "So it wasn't pity?" Mara said. "No. And it wasn't charity or something to do?" "No." He said it simply, without emphasis, like it didn't need any. It was recognition. "You recognized me too, I think, in the wagon that first night. That's why you said all right, instead of running." She thought about that. The wagon, the dark, the first night, his voice telling her about June and Lily with that careful steadiness that was the opposite of distance. It was presence, restrained but real. She had thought in the moment that it was just honesty. She hadn't thought yet about what it cost him. "Your daughter," she said. "Lily." "Yes." "How old would she be?" 10, he said, "in March." The road stretched ahead and the grass moved in the slight wind, and she thought about a 10-year-old girl with curly dark hair caught mid-motion in a photograph, both of them squinting against the sun. She thought about what it meant to carry that for 6 years in a house where everything stayed exactly as it had been. "The drawing above my window," she said quietly. "She made that when she was 3, he said. She was very serious about it, spent a whole afternoon on it. It's a good horse." Something shifted in his face, brief and complicated. "She would have told you it was a horse. Whether it actually looks like one was beside the point." Mara felt something in her chest move sideways, delicate and unexpected, like something that had been sitting in one position for a long time finally adjusting. She didn't say anything else. She let it settle. They were 2 miles from the ranch when the sky started doing something wrong. She noticed it first, the quality of the light changing in a way that wasn't about the hour. The clouds to the southwest were building in a particular way, stacking with a speed that didn't match the mild wind at ground level. The temperature dropped perceptibly. "Cole." "I see it." He pushed the horses to a faster pace. She gripped the seat rail without being told. The sky in the southwest went from gray to a particular greenish dark that she didn't have experience with, but that every instinct she had said was wrong, was very wrong. They made it to the ranch yard as the first wall of wind hit. It wasn't like the storm that first week. This was different in kind. The wind arrived all at once, a solid moving pressure that took her hat immediately and nearly took her off the wagon seat. Cole was already down and at the horses' heads before she'd fully registered what was happening, and she got down on her side and grabbed the nearest horse's bridle because they were both panicking, pulling against the harness in opposite directions. "Get them to the barn," Cole said, over the wind. "I know," she said. They got the horses unhitched and into the barn in a process that was more controlled chaos than procedure, but they got them in. The barn door was harder. The wind had it and didn't want to give it back, and she threw her weight against it alongside Cole, and they got it latched as the first rain arrived, not gradual but immediate, coming in sideways and cold and without any warning. Inside the barn it was dim and loud with the rain on the roof. The horses were still agitated, moving in their stalls, ears pinned. Cole was going down the line, checking latches, checking that nothing was going to come loose in the wind, and she was doing the same on the other side, without being asked because it was obvious and needed doing. The roof let go somewhere above the tack room. She heard it before she saw it, a sharp crack, and then the sound of shingles going, and then rain coming through in a thin, steady pour onto the corner they'd spent the morning partially fixing. "The patch didn't hold," she said. "No." Cole looked up at it. We'll deal with it after. They stayed in the barn for the worst of it, an hour, maybe slightly more. And during that time, the wind went through phases the way bad weather does, building and then easing and then building again harder. And the rain came in under the door and soaked the first 2 feet of barn floor, and the horses made their displeasure known continuously. She sat on a hay bale with her knees up and her arms around herself because she was wet through and the barn was cold. And Cole came and sat nearby on an upturned bucket, his coat dark with rain, and they listened to the storm work through its business. "You all right?" he asked. "Cold. We'll get inside soon." "I know." He was close enough that she could see water dripping off the edge of his jaw. His hair was flattened and his coat collar was dark and wet, and he was sitting on an upturned bucket in a hay-smelling barn in a storm, as though this was simply what the afternoon had become, which it had. He was entirely himself in it. No pretense of control over things he couldn't control. No performance of confidence. Just a man waiting out bad weather and doing the next necessary thing in front of him. She thought about what he'd said on the road. Recognition. "I've been armored for so long I don't know what I am without it," she said. She hadn't fully planned to say it. The storm made it easier somehow. The noise, the enforced closeness, the way bad weather strips things down. Cole looked at her. He didn't look away. "You're someone who unhitched 2 panicked horses in 40-mile wind," he said. "That's a start. That's a practical skill." "So is everything that matters." She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. The shape of it again, closer this time. "That's very frontier of you." Guilty. He looked back toward the barn door, where rain was still sheeting past the gap at the bottom. "The armor thing. I understand it. I wore mine for about 4 years. What changed?" He thought about it. "I got tired," he said. "That's the honest answer. Not that I decided to be braver or better. I just got too tired to keep the armor on all the time." He paused. "It's heavy." "Yes," she said. "It is." The wind shifted and eased, and the rain on the roof went from a roar to something more moderate, and then after another 20 minutes stopped almost entirely, leaving the barn in a dripping, hay-scented quiet. Outside, water was running off every surface in small, urgent streams. Cole stood and stretched and said, "Let's go see what the house looks like." The house had lost 2 shingles off the main roof, and a section of the east porch railing had come down, the section he'd already told her needed replacing. And there was a wet patch in the corner of the main room where the ceiling had let in maybe a cup of water. Otherwise, it had held. She went around checking while he went around checking, and they met in the kitchen and compared findings. "Could have been worse," she said. "Usually could." He was building a fire in the kitchen stove. His wet coat hung by the door. "I'll put the railing back tomorrow and patch the roof before the next rain." "I can help with the roof." "I know you can." She stood by the stove while it warmed, and she thought about the day. The drive into town, Ada Pruitt's deliberate non-acknowledgement, Margaret Voss and the second shelf muslin, the Fitch brothers, and her own voice surprising her, the road home and what Cole had said on it, the storm arriving all at once, the barn, the bucket, his voice saying recognition. She thought about how 6 weeks ago she had stood at an altar being laughed at and had not known what to do with her hands. She looked at her hands now. They were rougher than they'd been 6 weeks ago. They had hay under the nails and a new callus across the right palm from the fence wire and a fading bruise on 2 knuckles from where she'd caught them on the barn door latch in the wind this afternoon. They were the hands of someone who had been doing things. "Cole," she said. He looked up from the stove. "Thank you," she said. "For today. For all of it. For the longer road in and for stopping the wagon and for the barn." He watched her for a moment. He had the particular expression he sometimes got when she said something that landed differently than she'd known it would when she said it. Not moved exactly, or moved in a contained way, the way a person is moved who has learned not to show it immediately. "You don't have to thank me for any of that," he said. "I know. I'm doing it anyway." He held her gaze for a beat longer than usual. Then he turned back to the stove and adjusted the damper and said, "I'll make supper tonight. You've had enough of the day." She sat at the kitchen table and listened to him move around the kitchen. The sounds of someone who knew where everything was, who had cooked in this specific kitchen through 6 years of alone. and she looked at the window where the last of the evening light was catching the wet glass and breaking it into small separate fires, and she thought, something is changing. She thought, it's been changing for a while and I've been too careful to name it. She named it now, quietly, only to herself, in the kitchen where his wife had put the care into building the shelves, and his daughter had made a drawing that was probably a horse, and the stove was ticking with new warmth. She thought, I am beginning, for the first time in my life, to believe that I might deserve to be here. She didn't say it aloud. It was too new for that, too fragile, the kind of thing that can't survive being exposed to air before it's strong enough. But she held it carefully, the way you hold something that has just been made, and she let the kitchen be warm around her, and she waited for whatever came next. The belief that she might deserve to be there did not arrive cleanly or all at once. It came the way most real things came on that ranch, in pieces, through work, through small accumulated evidence that she was not going to be punished for existing. It came in the mornings when she got up before the alarm of her own anxiety and found the kitchen already warming because Cole had started the stove at first light. It came in the evenings when they ate together without performance or pretense, two people who had simply stopped requiring anything of each other beyond presence. It came in the specific satisfaction of a fixed thing staying fixed, the east porch railing that Cole rebuilt on a Thursday, with her holding the post level while he drilled, and the roof patch they spent a full morning on together, neither of them talking much. The silence between hammer strikes companionable in a way that felt, she thought, like something that had taken most of her life to find. The fragile thing she'd named quietly in the kitchen after the storm did not break. It grew slowly, the way plants grow in ground that isn't naturally hospitable. Not easily, not without setback, but persistently. Stubbornly, even. The way she had always been, when she was honest about it. It was Cole who first noticed the change, and he noticed it the way he noticed most things about her. Obliquely, through observation rather than direct comment, so that she registered he'd seen it without feeling examined. They were working the cattle one morning in the north pasture, moving a portion of the herd through a gate to rotate them to fresh grazing. It was the kind of work that required more coordination than it looked like from the outside. One person at the gate, one riding the edge of the herd, keeping the pressure consistent enough to move them, but not so sharp it spooked them into breaking. Mara had taken the riding position. She was on the bay gelding, who was still temperamental, but had developed a specific tolerance for her that he extended to almost no one else. And she was working him at an angle to the herd that she'd figured out through trial over several weeks. Cole was at the gate. He watched her for a long moment, the way she sat, the way she read the herd's movement and adjusted before the adjustment was obviously necessary. And when the last of the cattle were through and she brought the bay around, he said, "You've done this before." "My grandfather had beef cattle," she said. "Not this many, but enough." "You didn't tell me that." "You didn't ask." He latched the gate. There was something in his expression that she'd come to recognize as close to amusement without being quite there. A quality of contained warmth, like light through a window in another room. "What else haven't I asked?" She thought about it seriously. "I can build a dry stone wall. I can set a broken bone if I have to, animal or person. I'm a decent shot with a rifle, less good with a pistol." She paused. "I'm afraid of deep water. Not rivers, just deep water where I can't see the bottom." He considered this. "Good things to know. Were you keeping a running inventory?" "Starting one," he said, and clicked to his horse and started back toward the barn, and she followed him with something warm sitting unreasonably high in her chest. It was Margaret Voss who told her about the talk. She came out to the ranch on a Wednesday in late October, which was itself remarkable. Margaret Voss was not a social caller, not in the ordinary sense, and the drive out from Red Hollow was 40 minutes each way on a road that did not improve with autumn. Mara was in the yard splitting kindling when she heard a wagon and looked up and recognized the long, serious face even before the wagon had fully stopped. "Mrs. Voss," she said. "I have no business being out here," Margaret said as she climbed down, "and I won't pretend otherwise, but there are things being said in town that you ought to know about before you hear them from someone less considerate." Mara set down the hatchet. "Come inside." She made coffee while Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the posture of a woman who had been raised to sit up straight and had never successfully unlearned it. Cole was out checking the southern fence line and wasn't expected back until midday. Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup Mara gave her and said, Thomas Greer has been telling people the marriage was Barrett's idea as a way to settle a debt. Mara was still standing at the stove. She turned around. What debt? He's vague about the details, which means he invented them. The implication is that your parents owed Barrett something and you were the payment. Margaret's mouth was thin. He's been saying it quietly enough that it can't be called a direct accusation, but loudly enough that people are repeating it. Mara felt something cold move through her that was not quite anger and not quite humiliation, something that had characteristics of both without being entirely either. She had known that Thomas Greer existed in the world and that he was almost certainly not someone who had spent the last 6 weeks examining his conduct in that church. But she had not considered that he might be actively constructing a story that made her degradation into something he could be comfortable with. He needs it to make sense, Mara said. Margaret looked at her. Yes, he does. He needs it to mean something other than what it was. That would be my reading of it. Mara sat down at the table. What are people saying? The ones who are repeating it? Margaret was quiet for a moment. It's mixed, she said, which was more honest than Mara had expected. Some are willing to believe it because it explains what happened in a way that keeps Barrett behaving strangely and you remaining reduced. Some people don't believe it, but they repeat it anyway because it's interesting. She paused. And some, I'll be honest, they're a smaller number, but they exist. Some of them thought what Greer did in that church was not acceptable, and they've been looking for a reason to say so without having to admit they didn't say it at the time. Mara looked at her coffee. Which category are you in? Margaret was quiet for long enough that Mara looked up. I sat in the 3rd row and I didn't say a word, Margaret Voss said. Her voice was even, the way a person's voice gets even when they're being precise about something they're not proud of. I made a sound of distaste, as though the whole thing was mildly unfortunate rather than actively wrong. She set her cup down. I have 3 daughters. I kept thinking about that while I was sitting there, and still I didn't stand up. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a crow was doing something in the cedar tree near the fence. Why are you telling me this? Mara asked. Because Greer's story is going to reach your husband's ears within the week, regardless of what I do, Margaret said. And I thought you should hear it from someone who isn't. Enjoying it. She stood. I also thought you should know that Ed Hartwell told him to his face last week that Barrett was the most decent man in the county, and if Greer wanted to explain his own behavior, he ought to look closer to home. She buttoned her coat. Ed Hartwell has been known to say things. People listen to him. She left before Cole came back, and Mara stood in the yard watching the wagon until it was out of sight, and then stood there a while longer with the hatchet in her hand and the unsplit kindling at her feet. Cole heard it differently than she'd expected. She told him over supper that evening, directly and without softening any of it, because she had learned that he wanted the actual version of things, and softening them was a form of disrespect she couldn't offer him. He listened without expression, eating steadily, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Greer needs it to be something other than what it was, he said. She almost smiled. Those were nearly the exact words she'd said to Margaret Voss. Yes. He's not going to stop. Cole said it factually, not dramatically. Not on his own. No. She looked at her plate. Does it bother you? What people are saying? What bothers me, he said, is that it bothers you. That's not an answer. No. He set his fork down. What Greer is saying doesn't touch what's actually true. So in that sense, it doesn't bother me. He looked at her steadily. What bothers me is that you've built something real here. You've built it with your own hands and worked for it. And he's out there trying to make people see it as something you were assigned to, like a piece of furniture. His jaw was doing the thing it did. That bothers me considerably. She looked at him across the table, and something in her chest did that sideways shifting thing again, the thing that had been happening with increasing frequency over the past weeks, every time she registered that he was genuinely angry on her behalf and not on his own. We have to go back to town, she said. I know. Not just for supplies. Cole held her gaze for a moment. I know that too. They went back on a Friday, which was when Red Hollow was busiest. The end of the working week brought the surrounding ranch hands and farm families in for errands and socialization, and the main street had 4 times the foot traffic of a Tuesday morning. This was not accidental. They both knew it, and neither of them said so directly. Mara wore the better of her 2 dresses, not the wedding dress, which was still folded in the corner of her room and would probably stay there, but a dark green wool she'd made partly from the second shelf muslin and partly from a bolt of fabric she'd found in the chest at the foot of Cole's bed, left there by June, which he'd told her to use if it was useful without making it into anything more than practical. She'd spent 2 evenings on it, and it fit right, which the things in her closet at her parents' house rarely had. Cole wore a clean shirt and had used a razor, which she noticed and did not comment on. The wagon came onto Main Street from the south end this time, no longer road. The direct route, past the church, past everything. The church looked smaller than she remembered. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, some echo of the humiliation to live in the building itself, visible from outside. But it was just a wooden building with white paint peeling at the eaves and a door that needed rehinging. She looked at it and looked away and felt, not the absence of pain, but the presence of something stronger than it. She was aware, as they came down the street, that people were noticing them, not dramatically, not the way a crowd notices a spectacle, the quieter way, where a conversation pauses and an eye moves and a head turns just slightly. She had spent enough of her life being looked at to know the difference between the varieties, and this was not mockery. This was something more complicated than mockery. They tied up in front of Hartwell's, and Ed Hartwell came out from behind his counter before they'd fully gotten through the door, which was unusual for Ed, who was not a demonstrative man. "Barrett," he said, and shook Cole's hand. Then he looked at Mara. "Mrs. Barrett, good to see you back." "Thank you, Ed." She held his gaze. "Good to be back." The supplies took about 20 minutes. She needed thread and had brought her own measurements for a pair of work gloves she wanted to have made. Cole talked to Ed about the fence wire situation, which had an ongoing backorder problem, and Ed said things that were direct and practically useful, and at no point did anything in his manner suggest that there was anything unusual about this transaction. She appreciated it without being entirely comfortable with it, because she was old enough to understand that decency sometimes had an agenda and sometimes didn't, and she hadn't fully decided about Ed Hartwell. They were loading this wagon when Thomas Greer appeared. She heard him before she saw him, his voice first, carrying from across the street, talking to someone outside the barber's. A confident voice, a man comfortable in the acoustic of his own town. She kept her hands on the box she was loading and did not turn around. Cole had seen him. She could tell by the way Cole's movements changed, not visibly, not in any way that would be obvious to a bystander. But she was not a bystander. She knew how he moved, and there was a new quality of attention in him now. "Barrett," Greer called out. He was crossing the street. He had a friend with him, someone she didn't recognize, someone who had the look of moral support. "Haven't seen you in a while." Cole turned. He was completely still in the way that still men sometimes are. Not passive, but deliberate. "Thomas." Greer came up on the boardwalk side and looked at the wagon and then at Mara with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously and succeeding at none of them well. There was the performance of casual friendliness, and under that something that wanted to be contempt. And under that, she thought, under all of it, something smaller and less comfortable that she recognized because she had worn it herself in various forms over the years. The expression of a person who knows, on some level, that they behaved badly and has built an entire architecture of justification around it. "Heard you've been getting the ranch in order," Greer said to Cole. He had not addressed her directly. "Good for you." "It was already in order," Cole said. A beat. Greer's smile held slightly effortful now. "You know there's been some talk." "I've heard the talk," Cole said. "I'd like to know if you stand behind it." Greer's smile went fixed. The friend beside him shifted his weight. Around them, the ordinary business of a Friday Main Street was continuing, but in the way it continues when several people have decided to also be paying close attention to something else. "It's just what people are saying," Greer said. "I can't be responsible for what people—" "You're starting it," Cole said. He wasn't loud. He was the opposite of loud, which on a quiet street carried farther. "I know what you're saying, and I know why you're saying it. You behaved shamefully in that church, and you need a story that makes it look like something other than what it was." He paused. So, here's the truth, since you seem to need it plain. I married Mara Whitlock because I chose to. Nobody owed me anything. Nobody arranged anything. She is my wife because I asked her and she said yes. And everything you've been saying to the contrary is a lie that you're telling to protect your own vanity. The street was very quiet. Greer's jaw moved. He looked at Mara for the first time. Really looked, the way he'd looked at the altar, but with none of the contemptuous certainty he'd had then. Just a man standing in a street being told something about himself that he didn't like. And as for your reputation, Cole said, I'd spend a little less time worrying about mine. Greer said something, a half sentence, something defensive and trailing. And then he was walking, back the way he'd come, his friend following a step behind, and the Friday street gradually returned to its ordinary volume. Cole turned back to the wagon. He wasn't breathing harder than before. He hadn't been dramatic about any of it. Mara looked at him. She looked at the people on the boardwalk and across the street who had heard every word. She recognized some faces and some she didn't, but they were all there, present, witnesses. A few of them looked at the ground. A few of them were looking at her with expressions she didn't quite have categories for. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Yes, I did. He said it simply, not as a rebuke, not as a performance of heroism, just as a fact about himself that he was clear on. Help me get this last box loaded. She did. She was pulling the rope tight on the canvas cover when she heard someone say her name, not from close by, from the other side of the street, and she turned. Margaret Voss was standing outside the seamstress shop. She gave Mara one deliberate, unambiguous nod, and then she went back inside. It was a small thing. It was also not nothing. Cole came around the wagon and stood beside her, and they were looking at the main street of Red Hollow on a Friday afternoon, and she was aware of everyone on it, and he was probably aware of the same people, and neither of them moved toward the wagon yet. Mara, he said. Don't make it into a speech, she said. I wasn't going to. He paused. Do you hear music? She turned and looked at him. What? From somewhere down the street, the open doors of the hardware store, she thought, though it seemed unlikely, there was the thin sound of a fiddle. Someone was playing inside, probably for their own reasons, probably with no idea of what was happening in the street 30 yards away. It was a simple tune, the kind that didn't ask anything of the listener, the kind that existed in frontier towns the way weather did. Cole was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the contained warmth she'd come to know. Something more open than that, something he had apparently decided to let out now, on this specific Friday afternoon on this specific street. Dance with me, he said. She stared at him. Here. Yes. In the middle of the street. Yes. Cole, I know how many people are watching, he said. That's rather the point. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the church, the laughter, the 80 people, and her hands that hadn't known where to go, and her body that had stood still because she had simply run out of instructions. She thought about the first night in the wagon, and the kitchen, and the small room, and the child's drawing, and the second shelf muslin, and the horses, and the storm, and a bucket in a barn, and his voice on a road saying, recognition. She thought about who she had been 6 weeks ago and who she was right now, standing on the main street of the town that had laughed at her, in a dark green dress she had made herself, with a man who had just publicly and plainly told the truth on her behalf, not because she'd needed rescuing, but because it was simply true. She said, I'm not a good dancer. Neither am I. Then we'll both be terrible. Probably, he agreed. Does that change your answer? It didn't. She gave him her hand. He was right that he wasn't a good dancer. He had a sense of rhythm that was adequate and a hold that was careful and somewhat stiff. And they moved in the general direction of the music in the approximate manner of two people who knew the theory of dancing better than the practice, and neither of them cared. The street did not transform. The people watching did not break into applause. Life on a frontier main street continued to be what it was, complicated and imperfect and mostly concerned with its own business. But a space opened up around them, slight and instinctive, the way spaces open around things that are happening for real rather than for show. She was aware of it. Cole was probably aware of it. They danced anyway. His hand at her back was steady. She had both of his hands now, and the fiddle was doing something in the key of G, and her boots were not ideal for this, but they sufficed. And she thought, I am standing in the street where I was humiliated, and I am not hiding, and I am not performing, and I am not surviving. I am just here, present, myself. The music shifted and they slowed with it, and at some point she realized she had stopped thinking and was simply moving, which was its own kind of thing, its own quiet miracle of the ordinary. When the fiddle stopped, they were standing still in the middle of the street with their hands still loosely held between them, and the space around them was still there, and several people had not gone back to what they were doing before. Well, Cole said. Yes, she agreed. He was looking at her with that open expression still on his face, unguarded in a way that cost him something, and he'd paid it anyway. She understood what it had cost because she understood now what it cost her when she let her guard down, how much effort it had taken over 23 years to build the walls, and how strange it was to find that the walls were also exhausting from the inside. She looked at him and thought, I am done being afraid of this, not of him. She had not been afraid of him for a while. She was done being afraid of the thing that had been building between them since the wagon, since the kitchen, since the barn in the storm. This specific and unhurried thing that looked from the outside like two careful people moving slowly and felt from the inside like standing finally in the right room after looking in every wrong one. Let's go home, she said. It was the first time she had called it that aloud. She heard it herself as she said it, home, and watched it register on his face, quiet and significant. Yes, he said. Let's. They walked back to the wagon, and she climbed up on her side, and he climbed up on his, and he took the reins and they moved out of Red Hollow the way they'd come in, down Main Street, past the church with its peeling paint, past the cedar trees on the south edge of town, and out onto the road that led back to the ranch. The sky was clear and cold and high. The land stretched away in all directions, enormous and patient, the way it always was. Trouble was being cooperative for once, which she chose to take as a sign of something even though she didn't believe in signs. She was quiet for the first few miles, and Cole let her be quiet, the way he always let her be what she was, without requiring it to be something else. Then she said, You knew I'd say yes to the dance. He thought about it. I hoped. That's honest. I try to be. She looked at the road ahead. The late afternoon light was coming in at a low angle that caught the dry grass and turned it the particular amber that meant the season was changing. She was cold, and the wagon was hard under her, and her left boot was going to raise a blister if she wasn't careful. And she realized without drama or announcement, happy. Not the performed version. Not the performed version she'd worn at her parents' table while her father talked about respectable arrangements and her mother said careful things. The actual kind, located in the body, a little uncomfortable, not entirely certain of itself, not requiring an audience. She leaned her shoulder against Cole's arm. Just that. Not elaborate. She leaned against him and he adjusted his grip on the reins slightly and moved half an inch toward her, which was as much acknowledgement as he needed to give and exactly as much as she needed to receive. They rode home that way, leaning together at the edges in the long cold light of the changing season. The blister from her left boot was real by the time they got back. She noticed it while pulling off her boots at the door, a tight hot spot on the inside of her heel that she'd been ignoring for the last mile of road because she had been leaning against Cole's arm and didn't want to move. She sat on the porch step and examined it with the detached pragmatism she'd developed for all physical inconveniences on the ranch. Not dramatic, not ignored, just dealt with. Cole came around from the barn and saw her looking at her heel and said nothing, went inside, and came back with a strip of clean cloth and a tin of the salve he kept for the horses' scrapes, which also worked on people, and which she had already figured out for herself 3 weeks ago. He sat on the step beside her and she let him wrap it, which was itself a thing, the letting. She had spent a long time being someone who handled her own inconveniences quietly and alone. Not from pride exactly, but from the ingrained expectation that requesting help would cost something she couldn't afford to pay. Not the most dignified end to the day, she said. I don't know. I've had worse Fridays. He tied off the cloth. How does it feel? Better? She looked at his hand still holding her foot. Cole. I meant it, about home. He looked at her then, with that open expression he'd let out on the main street, and apparently decided not to put away again. I know you did, he said. I meant it too. When I offered it. The first night. She nodded slowly. He set her foot down and stood and offered his hand to help her up. And she took it, and when she was standing, he didn't let go immediately, and she didn't pull away, and they stood on the porch in the last of the afternoon light, like two people who had figured out something without being entirely sure when the figuring had happened. The evening was ordinary in the way the evenings had become ordinary. Good food, low fire, the sounds of the land outside settling into dark. But ordinary now had a different weight to it. The ordinary was no longer something she was enduring. It was something she was living inside, and the distinction was everything. Her parents came 3 weeks later. She had known it was coming. She'd written the letter she'd promised, short, informational, nothing that invited response, but nothing that was cruel either, because she was trying to be someone who didn't carry cruelty even toward people who had earned it. She had written that she was settled and well, and that the ranch was good work, and that she would write again when she had more to say. She had not written, "Come visit." She had not written, "I forgive you." She had not written any of the things she was still working out how to feel. They came on a Tuesday. Her father drove, which meant her mother had decided this was necessary, and her father had gone along, which was the architecture of their entire marriage condensed into a single piece of information. Cole was at the south fence when the wagon came down the drive. Mara was in the yard, splitting the last of the morning's kindling, and she put the hatchet down and straightened and watched her parents' wagon come toward her through the cold November air. Her mother got down first. Eleanor Whitlock was a small woman who had spent 30 years making herself appear larger through the sheer force of her disapproval of things. And she had that quality now, standing in the yard of a ranch she had never been to, looking at her daughter with an expression that was trying to be several things at once and not quite managing any of them. Her father, George, came down after. He looked older than she remembered. She had last seen him on the steps of the church, failing to finish a sentence. He looked like a man who had been trying to finish it ever since and hadn't gotten there yet. "Mara," her mother said. "Mother." She kept her voice even. "Father, come inside." She made coffee because it was cold, and because it gave her hands something to do, and because the kitchen was the room in this house she felt most herself in. Her parents sat at the table and looked around them with the particular assessment that people perform when they are trying to determine whether a place confirms or denies what they already believed about it. "It's smaller than I expected," her mother said. "It's practical," Mara said. "It works." "You look—" Her mother stopped. She looked at Mara's hands, which were rough and calloused, and bore the fading bruise from the barn door and the remnants of 2 weeks' worth of fence work and horse care. "Different. I am different," Mara said. Her father was looking at the photograph on the shelf in the main room, visible through the doorway. He turned back. "Is Mr. Barrett?" "He's working," Mara said. "He'll be in at midday." She set the coffee down and sat across from them and did not arrange herself into anything other than what she was. "I assume you didn't come just to see the kitchen." Her mother set her cup down. "We've heard things." "I imagine you have. About Barrett standing up to Greer. About the two of you in the street." Her mother's voice had that careful quality it got when she was approaching something she hadn't decided yet how to handle. "People are saying things." "People were saying things before," Mara said. "They said them while you were sitting in the second row." Her mother's mouth pressed together. "I'm not saying it to wound you," Mara said, and she meant it. She was done with wanting to wound people. It was too expensive and produced nothing she actually wanted. "I'm saying it because it's true, and I think we have to start with what's true if we're going to talk at all." Her father said, "Mara." Then he stopped again. "You're going to want to say you're sorry," she said to him, not unkindly. "And I think you probably are. I think you're both sorry in the way people are sorry when something turns out worse than they planned, and they can see in retrospect where the plan was wrong." She held his gaze. "But I need you to understand what you did, not just that it ended badly, what you actually did." George Whitlock looked at his hands on the table. They were old hands, she realized. She hadn't noticed when they'd gotten old. He said, "We were trying to do right by you, in the only way we could see." "I know that. That doesn't make it— I know it doesn't make it right." No, she said. It doesn't. She paused. You were ashamed of me. Not of what happened at the church. Before. For years before. And you thought if someone would agree to marry me, it would fix something. I'm not sure if it was supposed to fix something about me, or something about how you felt in this town, but I know it wasn't really about what was best for me. Her mother made a sound, not a protest, something smaller than that, something that had hurt in it. I know you love me, Mara said. I've always known that, but love was never the thing in question. She looked at her mother directly. You taught me to be ashamed of myself. You didn't mean to, but every time someone said something and you stayed quiet, every time you arranged me into smaller and smaller spaces so there would be less of me for people to disapprove of. That's what you were teaching me, that I was something to be apologized for. Eleanor Whitlock was looking at the table. Her hands were folded in her lap, and they were completely still, the way they'd been completely still in the front pew of the church on that day, and Mara thought, there it is. There's the shape of the whole thing. I'm not going to keep carrying it, Mara said. I want to be clear about that. Not because I'm angry. I am angry, a little. I think I'll probably be angry for a while longer before it's finished, but because it doesn't belong to me. It never did. It was always yours. The shame. It was yours, and you gave it to me because you didn't know what else to do with it. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire ticked. Outside, the cold November wind moved through the cedars. Her father looked up. His eyes were wet, which was something she had never seen in her life, in 30 years of being his daughter. What do you need from us? He asked. His voice was not steady. Tell me what you need. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it, in pieces, since the first week on the ranch, in the small room at night, working through it slowly the way she worked through all problems. I need you to see me, she said, not manage me, not explain me to other people, not reduce me so there's less surface area for judgment. Just see me. She paused. I need you to come to this house and look at the life I've built and say, this is real, and it is good. And she did this herself, without needing to qualify it. Her mother looked up. Something was moving in her face that had the quality of something long fixed beginning to shift. It is good, Eleanor Whitlock said. Her voice was low and effortful. Mara, this is good. What you have here. It was not a complete thing. It was not a full reckoning or a clean resolution or the end of 30 years of ingrained habit. But it was real, and her mother had said it without qualification, and Mara sat with it and let it be what it was. Partial and genuine, and more than she'd expected, which was perhaps the most honest form of progress. Cole came in at noon. He took his coat off at the door and washed his hands at the basin and came into the kitchen with the expression of a man who was aware that he was walking into something and had decided to walk into it anyway. He shook her father's hand and nodded to her mother and sat at the table, and she brought him coffee. And he said thank you the way he always said it, and she felt her parents watching this small exchange and registering what it was. Her father asked Cole about the ranch, practically, specifically, acreage and herd size and the fence situation. Things a man asks when he is trying to see the actual substance of something rather than the surface. Cole answered him plainly and without pretension, giving the honest version that included the south fence and the ongoing roof situation and the fact that trouble was still a menace who had earned his name daily. George Whitlock listened with an attention that had something of acknowledgement in it. Her mother talked to Mara about smaller things, the kitchen, the curtains Mara had made, the question of whether they had enough wood in before the hard cold came. Surface things, still, but surface things said in a different register than before, without the managing quality, without the sense of constant trimming and reduction. Just her mother talking to her as someone who lived in a house and knew things about it. They left in the early afternoon. The drive back would be long and the days were short now. Her father hugged her at the wagon, which was not something he did, which made it a thing. She let him. It was awkward and brief and real. Her mother held both of her hands and looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard to say something her mouth wasn't quite finding, and Mara said, "Write to me. Just write to me regularly." "I will," her mother said. "I will." She watched the wagon go. Cole came and stood beside her, not touching, just there, and they watched until the wagon was past the stand of scrubby juniper at the property line and gone. "How are you?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "Check with me in an hour." He nodded. That was a sufficient answer, and he knew it was. No. The hour passed, and the afternoon passed, and by evening she had a sense of herself again. Not the wounded version that had walked out of that kitchen with her hands in her lap, but the one who had split kindling and lived here and made something of it. She sat with it that night after supper and tried to find the wound she'd been carrying and found that it was smaller, not gone. She wasn't so hopeful or so dishonest as to think a single afternoon had resolved what 30 years had built, but the wound had changed shape, the way wounds do when they've been named and handed back to where they belong. It was hers still, but it was the right size now. It fit inside her life without taking up all of it. She was thinking about this in the main room that evening, sitting near the fire with her mending, when Cole came in from the last check of the barn and said, "The bay's been limping on the right foreleg. I think he picked up a stone this afternoon." "Did you check the frog?" "I did. It's out, but I want to poultice it overnight to make sure." "I'll help." He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know." She set down the mending and stood. "Let me get my coat." They went out into the cold dark and worked in the warm lamp-lit barn side by side, checking the hoof again and applying the poultice with the careful attention that injured animals require. Slow, deliberate, no sudden movements. The horses trust the thing being preserved as much as the hoof itself. Trouble submitted to it with more patience than was usual for him, which she suspected was because he'd been sore all afternoon and had run out of energy for defiance. "There," Cole said, tying off the bandage. Mara ran her hand along the gelding's neck. He dropped his head slightly, which was about as affectionate as Trouble got. "He'll be fine by morning," she said. "Probably." Cole was cleaning his hands with the cloth. "Your parents?" "Yes." "You were honest with them." "I tried to be." He hung the cloth on the nail by the tack room. "How does it feel?" She thought about that. She thought about her mother saying it is good, and her father's wet eyes, and the awkward, brief hug at the wagon, and 30 years of being arranged into smaller spaces, and one afternoon in a kitchen that couldn't undo 30 years but could, maybe, begin to mean something different was possible. "Like something that's been closed for a long time got opened," she said, "and I don't know yet what the air in there is like, but it's open." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's more than most people get." "I know." They walked back to the house in the dark, their breath visible in the cold air. The stars were extraordinary in the way they only got this far from town, dense and unhurried and indifferent to everything happening beneath them. She had spent years feeling indifference as hostility. She understood it differently now. The stars were not hostile. The land was not hostile. The world was not organized around her diminishment. It was organized around nothing except its own massive continuance, and she was simply in it, as entitled to her place in it as anything else that endured. That was not a small thing to understand. It had taken her 23 years and a humiliation and a wagon ride and 6 weeks of physical work and a man who had not needed her to be anything other than what she was to understand it. But she understood it now. November gave way to December and the cold came in properly, the kind that found every gap in the walls and made the fire in the main room a necessity rather than a comfort. They spent the first week of December doing what the ranch required: extra bedding for the horses, checking the water troughs twice daily to break ice, making sure the stores were right for the hard months. One evening, about 10 days into December, Cole came in from the barn and said, "I want to show you something." She followed him back outside, which she did without question because in her experience when Cole said he wanted to show her something, it was worth the cold. He led her around the east side of the barn to where the fence turned south, and he stopped and she looked, and there, in the angle of the fence and the barn wall, where the south-facing overhang had been catching the last of the winter sun, something had been built. A cold frame, 4 boards making a low box filled with dark soil and covered with a piece of old window glass. Inside, small green shoots were just visible, the definitive, determined green of something that had decided to grow regardless of the season. She stood very still. "I started it in October," he said. "I wasn't sure it would take." He paused. June had a kitchen garden, I let it go after. I thought, I thought you might want a start of one. For spring. She looked at the small green things growing in their cold frame in December, with the barn wall sheltering them from the north wind, and she thought about June, who had put care into the kitchen. She thought about Lily, who had made a drawing that was probably a horse. She thought about a man who had spent 6 years in a house with a photograph on the shelf and a child's drawing pinned above a window, alone in all the ways a person can be alone. She thought about herself on the steps of a church in a dress her mother had stayed up late to make. And she thought about the wagon, and the small room, and the 37 days of accumulated evidence that she was not going to be punished for existing. Kale and winter radish so far, Cole said. I can start the rest in February if you tell me what you want. She turned to look at him. He was watching the cold frame, not her, with the careful expression of a man who has offered something and is waiting to see what it means. Tomatoes, she said, and herbs, rosemary and thyme, some squash along the south fence. She paused. And whatever June grew, whatever she had, I'd like to know what it was. He was quiet for a moment. When he looked at her, it was with that open expression, the one that had appeared on the main street and hadn't entirely retreated since. Marigolds, he said. She said they kept the bugs off the vegetables, and they were yellow. Then marigolds. He nodded once. The cold was significant, and the stars above them were enormous, and the green things in the cold frame were doing what green things do, quietly and without requiring any witness. Cole, she said. Yes. She had thought about how to say this and hadn't been able to find the right form for it, because the right form didn't really exist in words. It was the kind of thing that was mostly true in the body, in the accumulated evidence of days, in the specific weight of a silence between two people who had stopped pretending to be less than they were. I'm glad you were sitting in the back, she said. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was brief and total, like light across water. So am I, he said. Every day I'm glad. They stood in the cold for another minute, looking at the green shoots in their cold frame, and then went back inside because the cold was real and the fire was waiting, and there was no need to stand in the dark proving something that had already been proven. Winter settled in and the ranch became a closed world, self-sufficient and demanding and full of the specific intimacy that hard seasons impose on people who share a space, the forced proximity, the shared problem of staying warm and fed and operational, the way difficulty strips away everything that isn't necessary and leaves only what is. What was necessary was evident by January. They said it plainly, the way they did most things. Not in the dark room, not through suggestion or implication. In the kitchen, on a Tuesday evening after supper, with the fire going and the cold outside and Trouble's recovered leg no longer a concern, and the cold frame sitting in its sheltered angle doing its quiet work. She said, I think I love you. He said, I know I love you. I've known it for a while. Why didn't you say? Because you weren't ready for it to be said. And saying it before you were ready would have been about me, not you. She sat with that. That's the most patient thing I've ever heard. I had practice, he said. You can't hurry cattle. She almost laughed. Then she did laugh, actually, finally, the real kind. Surprised out of her, slightly undignified, the kind of laugh that doesn't ask permission. He watched it happen with an expression that was the warmest thing she'd ever seen on a human face, contained and complete and not requiring anything further. That was winter. Spring arrived the way it always does on the frontier. Not gently, not in a gradual warming, but in starts and retreats. Warm days followed by late frost, green coming up through mud, the land going from dead to alive in a process that was never smooth and never entirely predictable. The garden went in, section by section, through April. The south fence got a new line of posts she drove herself while Cole worked the north pasture. The kitchen curtains were replaced. The porch railing on the west side, the one she'd been looking at all winter, got rebuilt from the ground up, better than the original. She planted the marigolds last on a morning in late April when the ground was finally warm enough and the risk of hard frost had passed. She put them along the south edge of the kitchen garden, yellow against the dark soil, exactly where they needed to be. Cole came and crouched beside her while she was patting the last one in, and he looked at the row of yellow plants and didn't say anything for a moment. She'd have liked it, he said finally. I hope so. She would, he said. She liked anyone who took things seriously. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at the garden. The kale that had come through the winter and was already going strong. The new rows of tomatoes not yet transplanted. The herbs starting in their corner. The marigolds in their brave yellow row. It was not a finished thing. It would never be a finished thing. Gardens weren't. That was the whole point of them. But it was alive and it was here, and she had put it here, in this specific ground, in this specific place. She was someone who had a garden now. That was a fact about her. She was someone who could unhitch panicked horses in 40-mile wind and set a bone if she had to, and build a dry stone wall and drive a fence post and read the weather coming off the western hills 20 minutes before it arrived. She was someone who had walked into a town that had laughed at her and stood in the main street and spoken to a man who needed his vanity protected, and she had not flinched. She was someone who had sat across from her parents at this kitchen table and said what was true and then let them sit with it. She was someone with rough hands and a healed blister and a persistent argument with a horse who had never entirely decided to respect her but kept choosing her anyway, which she thought was probably the most honest form of regard. She had finally and completely and without qualification decided, someone who deserved to be here. Not because anyone had told her so, though Cole had told her so in every possible way except the direct one. Not because the town had stopped talking about her, though it mostly had. Or because Thomas Greer had faced any particular consequence. Though Ed Hartwell's opinion of him had become generally known, and in a small town that was its own form of consequence. Not because her parents had changed or the world had rearranged itself to accommodate her, because she had done the work of it, quietly and continuously and without much celebration, the same way she fixed things on the ranch, the next thing and the next and the next, until the accumulated result was a life that looked and felt like hers. That was the part nobody had told her about when she was 12 and first learning to make herself smaller. Nobody had told her that the world's opinion of her was not a fact about her, it was a fact about the world. Nobody had told her that worth wasn't something granted or revoked by the people in a room, but something built, internal, slowly and imperfectly, by the choices a person made about how to endure and whether to endure, and what they were willing to hold on to when everything else was taken. She had built it here, in this specific ground. In a barn in a storm, and a kitchen at midnight, and a main street on a Friday afternoon. In fence lines and cold frames, and a garden going in section by section through an April that couldn't make up its mind about the frost. Cole stood and offered his hand, and she took it and stood, and they looked at the garden together in the morning light, the marigolds small and definite in their yellow row. "What next?" he said. "Tomato seedlings," she said. "They need to go in this week if the nights stay warm. Tonight looks clear. Then tomorrow morning." He nodded. She kept his hand. They walked back toward the house through the spring morning, through the light that was coming in low and honest across the flat land and the long grass, and the 400 head of cattle moving slowly in the north pasture, and the barn where trouble was probably already doing something he shouldn't, and the cold frame that had started the whole garden, and the house that had belonged to other people's grief and was now in the ongoing process of becoming something else entirely. Behind them, in the south-facing corner of the kitchen garden, the marigolds stood in the light and did what they were made to do. Not dramatically, not perfectly, just persistently, yellow against the dark earth, alive in the ground that had been given to them, which was, in the end, all any of it required.